Alright guys, this is a strange one, and I mean that genuinely. Iran just claimed its Revolutionary Guard fired cruise missiles and completely destroyed one of Amazon's central data centers in Bahrain. Big claim, dramatic statement, state media running with it hard. And the US military's response was not what you'd expect. It wasn't a retaliatory strike announcement. It wasn't a Pentagon press conference. It was basically silence, and the story quietly falling apart under its own weight within hours. Let's break down exactly what happened here, because this tells you a lot about how this war is actually being fought right now, on and off the battlefield. Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. It's Ryan on the Max Afterburner channel, former F-15E combat fighter pilot, F-16 Thunderbird pilot. I've flown the Boeing 737, the Airbus A220, flown airliners for many years, and today's story is a little different from what we usually cover, because this one is as much about information warfare as it is about actual missiles and actual airstrikes. So stick around, I'll walk you through exactly what Iran claimed, what the evidence actually shows, and what the US military's real response has been throughout all of this. Let's get into it. So here's what happened. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps put out a statement carried by their state-affiliated outlet, Fars News Agency, claiming that their aerospace force had attacked the central data infrastructure of the American company Amazon in Bahrain with several cruise missiles and destroyed it. This wasn't framed as some random act of aggression either. Iran specifically said it was retaliation for a US strike a day earlier on the construction site of Iran's Darkovan nuclear power plant, which Iran describes as a non-military facility. And it wasn't just Amazon in that statement either. Iranian media also claimed the IRGC hit a US military complex in Jordan, targeted accommodation facilities used by American personnel at Bahrain's Sheikh Issa Air Base, and struck Bahrain's civil air navigation systems and radar installations in Muharraq and Riffa. Now here's where it gets interesting, because almost immediately this claim started falling apart. Bahraini officials said their air defenses had actually intercepted the attack, and importantly, they never identified Amazon or confirmed any commercial infrastructure had actually been struck at all. Amazon Web Services never publicly commented on the claim. US officials never independently confirmed that an AWS facility had been hit. And when people online started pointing to the AWS health dashboard, which showed service in the Bahrain region as disrupted, as proof the strike had succeeded, that turned out to be misleading too, because that same dashboard had been showing the Bahrain region as disrupted continuously since March, meaning there was no way to tell if Tuesday's claimed strike actually caused any new degradation at all, or if people were just looking at months-old disruption and assuming it was fresh evidence. So think about what you're actually looking at here. A dramatic, specific claim of a major American company's data infrastructure getting destroyed by cruise missiles, and when you actually go looking for confirmation, you find silence from Amazon. No confirmation from Bahrain, no confirmation from the US, and the one piece of technical evidence people were using to back up the claim turns out to predate the claimed attack by months. That's not necessarily proof nothing happened. War zones are messy and verification takes time, but it's a pretty striking gap between the confidence of Iran's public statement and the actual evidence available to back it up. And this isn't even the first time this exact pattern has played out. Data centers, particularly Amazon's, have actually been targeted repeatedly throughout this entire war, going all the way back to the opening days of the conflict in early March, when Iranian Shahed drones struck 2 AWS data centers in the United Arab Emirates before dawn, with a third commercial facility in Bahrain also getting hit, though it was less clear at the time whether that third one was deliberately targeted or just collateral damage. Iran officially labeled 18 US technology companies as legitimate military targets that same month, including Amazon, Microsoft, Google, Apple, Meta, Oracle, Intel, Cisco, Dell, Palantir, Nvidia, and more. And in early April, Iran struck an actual confirmed AWS facility in Bahrain, and this time, Bahrain's own Interior Ministry confirmed civil defense forces responded to a fire at the site following that strike. So there is real, documented precedent of Iran successfully hitting this kind of commercial cloud infrastructure earlier in the war, which honestly makes this specific unverified claim from this latest round even more interesting, because it stands in pretty sharp contrast to earlier incidents where local authorities did confirm damage happened. Let me dig a little deeper into why data centers specifically have become such an attractive target in this conflict, because I think it's worth understanding just how much of modern life actually runs through facilities like these before we go further. A data center isn't just a building full of computers storing files. It's the physical infrastructure underneath basically everything we do digitally now. Banking transactions, government services, streaming, communications, business logistics, artificial intelligence processing. All of it runs through server farms, just like the ones Amazon operates in Bahrain and the UAE. And in a region like the Gulf, where AWS launched its Bahrain cloud region back in 2019 as its very first data center presence in the entire Middle East. That infrastructure now serves businesses, financial institutions, and government agencies across the whole region, offering cloud computing, data storage, artificial intelligence capability, and other digital services that a huge number of organizations across multiple countries have come to depend on. So when Iran frames these facilities as legitimate military targets because they might support what they call the enemy's military and intelligence operations, they're also, whether intentionally or not, threatening an enormous amount of purely civilian and commercial infrastructure that regional businesses, banks, and governments rely on every single day, completely separate from anything related to actual combat operations. I also want to walk through the broader pattern of tech company threats Iran has made throughout this war, because the Amazon claim doesn't exist in isolation. It's part of a much longer running campaign of both rhetoric and actual strikes aimed at American technology companies specifically. Back in late March, Iran officially labeled 18 different U.S. technology companies as legitimate military targets. And that list reads like a who's who of the entire American tech industry: Amazon, Microsoft, Google, Apple, Meta, Oracle, Intel, HP, IBM, Cisco, Dell, Palantir, NVIDIA, Tesla, Boeing, and more. Iran's military spokesperson even released a video specifically threatening the Stargate AI data center project in the United Arab Emirates, that massive $500 billion joint venture between OpenAI, SoftBank, and Oracle to build AI data centers, with the video containing a message saying nothing stays hidden to their site, even if it's hidden by Google. That threat came directly after President Trump had himself threatened to strike Iran's civilian infrastructure, things like power plants and water desalination facilities, if Iran didn't reopen the Strait of Hormuz. So you can see this pattern where both sides have increasingly moved toward threatening and, in some cases, actually striking civilian and commercial infrastructure as a form of pressure and retaliation, well beyond the traditional battlefield targets like military bases, naval vessels, and command centers that we've talked about extensively on this channel in earlier videos. And it hasn't just been American companies on the receiving end either, which I think is an important point of context. A data center in Tehran, operated by Iran's own state-run bank SEPA, was reportedly struck by a missile, apparently fired by the United States or its allies, showing that this kind of infrastructure targeting has genuinely gone both directions throughout this war. Not just Iran hitting American commercial assets in the Gulf. That tells you this entire category of target, financial, and data infrastructure has essentially become fair game for both sides in this conflict, which honestly represents a pretty significant shift in how modern warfare gets conducted, moving well beyond the traditional focus on purely military assets into something that touches the actual digital backbone that both civilian economies and, to some extent, military logistics now depend on. Let me also spend some more time on the verification problem here, because I think it's one of the most important and most underappreciated challenges of covering a conflict like this in real time. In previous wars, verifying a claimed strike often meant waiting for satellite imagery, waiting for journalists to physically reach a location, waiting for official government statements from multiple independent sources to line up. In this conflict, you've got an added layer of complexity, because a lot of the targets being claimed, like commercial data centers, don't necessarily show visible damage the way a destroyed building or a burning vehicle would. A data center could be hit, could suffer partial damage, could have specific server racks or cooling systems damaged without the facility being visibly destroyed from a satellite photo, and the actual operational impact might only show up through indirect evidence like service disruptions on a status dashboard, which, as we already discussed, turned out to be genuinely unreliable evidence in this specific case, because that same dashboard had already been showing disruption for months before this claimed strike even happened. That creates a genuinely difficult environment for anyone, journalists, analysts, or just people trying to follow this conflict online, to actually separate confirmed reality from wartime propaganda, especially when both sides have clear incentives to either exaggerate their own successes or downplay damage they've actually suffered. I think it's also worth talking about how this fits into the broader concept of information warfare, which has become such a central part of how modern conflicts get fought and perceived around the world. Every single claim like this, verified or not, gets amplified across social media, gets picked up by state media outlets designed specifically to shape domestic and international perception, and gets debated and dissected by analysts and ordinary people online within hours of being announced. Iran clearly understands that value. Announcing a dramatic strike on a symbol of American economic and technological power generates enormous attention regardless of whether independent verification ever actually catches up to the initial claim. And in a strange way, even a claim that later gets seriously questioned or falls apart under scrutiny still accomplishes some of its strategic purpose in the short term, because the initial headline, The initial wave of attention and concern has already happened by the time anyone gets around to seriously fact-checking it. That's a genuinely challenging dynamic for anyone trying to accurately understand what's actually happening in this war in real time, because the incentive structure for both sides increasingly favors making dramatic claims quickly over waiting for verified, confirmed information. Let me explain why Iran would be targeting Amazon data centers in the first place, because I think this is a genuinely fascinating and honestly kind of unprecedented development in modern warfare. This appears to be the first time in history that a country has deliberately targeted commercial data centers during an active war. Iran's justification has consistently been that these facilities support what they call the enemy's military and intelligence operations, essentially arguing that because cloud computing infrastructure increasingly underpins financial systems, government services, and potentially military logistics, hitting a data center is a legitimate way to degrade an adversary's broader capability, even though the facility itself is owned by a private American technology company rather than a government or military entity. Researchers looking at this conflict have pointed out that the U.S. actually requires cloud providers to store government and military data within U.S. borders, or on Department of Defense bases specifically, meaning moving sensitive military data to a commercial Amazon facility in the Gulf would require special authorization that may or may not have even been granted in the first place. So there's a real question about whether Iran's entire justification for targeting these facilities, that they support American military and intelligence operations, is even accurate to begin with. Now let's get to the part of the title that I think is genuinely the most important. What did the US military actually do in response to all of this? And here's the thing, nobody saw this coming because there wasn't some dramatic, targeted counterstrike specifically responding to the Amazon claim. What actually happened is that US Central Command simply continued doing exactly what it had already been doing, night after night, regardless of Iran's claim. This entire episode took place during the 10th consecutive night of American strikes on Iran, part of a sustained campaign that had already been grinding forward since President Trump declared the earlier ceasefire officially over. CENTCOM wrapped up its latest round of strikes, hitting Iranian military command centers, maritime capabilities, missile and drone launch sites, and air defense systems, the same categories of targets we've talked about on this channel in previous videos covering this campaign. There was no special emergency response, no rushed retaliatory strike specifically framed around the Amazon claim, just the continuation of an already relentless, already sustained bombing campaign that had been running for over a week and a half straight at that point. And I think that's actually the real story here, the thing nobody expected. Iran put out this dramatic, specific claim about destroying major American commercial infrastructure, clearly designed to generate headlines, to demonstrate capability, to show they could reach beyond the battlefield and hit symbols of American economic power. And the American response was essentially to not treat it as a significant enough event to change anything about the ongoing campaign at all. No emergency Pentagon briefing specifically addressing it, no public acknowledgement validating the claim's significance, just the continuation of the exact same systematic pressure campaign that had already been underway, hitting the same categories of military targets it had been hitting for over a week. In a strange way, that muted, almost dismissive non-response might be more strategically significant than a dramatic counterstrike would have been, because it signals the U.S. either doesn't consider the claim credible enough to respond to specifically, or considers it strategically irrelevant enough that it doesn't warrant deviating from the existing campaign plan. I also want to point out just how much broader this whole situation had gotten by this point in the war, because the Amazon claim was really just one thread in an incredibly chaotic stretch. On the same day, Iran also targeted sites in Kuwait and Jordan. A tanker got hit in the Strait of Hormuz, and Yemen's Iran-aligned Houthi forces announced they'd impose a naval blockade on Saudi Arabia, opening up a potential entirely new front in this war and raising the threat to global energy supplies, well beyond just the Gulf itself. Despite all of that escalating chaos, which by most accounts had all but wrecked the interim peace agreement that had been signed just the month before, there were still signs that both Tehran and Washington wanted to eventually get back to some kind of diplomatic track, which is part of why oil prices, even with all this happening, stayed relatively contained rather than spiking into complete panic territory. I also want to spend more time unpacking why the US military's muted response here is genuinely so significant, because I don't think it's something people naturally think about when they picture how a modern military is supposed to respond to an adversary's claims. In a lot of past conflicts, there's an instinct, both from military leadership and from the public watching at home, to want a direct, proportional, immediately visible response to any claimed attack, especially when targeting something as symbolically significant as major American commercial infrastructure. But what we've actually seen throughout this specific war is a US military that appears to be operating from a very deliberate, very disciplined targeting plan, one built around systematically degrading specific categories of Iranian military capability, command centers, air defenses, missile and drone launch sites, maritime assets, rather than reactively chasing every individual claim or provocation that gets announced by Iranian state media. That's a genuinely different way of prosecuting a war than what a lot of people might expect. And I think it reflects lessons learned from watching how information warfare and propaganda claims have played out in other recent conflicts around the world, where militaries that let themselves get pulled into reactive, tit-for-tat responses to every single claimed provocation often end up with campaigns that lack coherent strategic direction, bouncing from target to target based on whatever the adversary just announced, rather than pursuing a consistent, planned objective. Think about it from a pure resource allocation standpoint too, because this is something I think about constantly from my background as a pilot who's actually had to plan and execute real combat missions. Every single strike package, every sortie, every weapon employed in a campaign like this represents finite resources: aircraft availability, munitions inventory, aircrew readiness, all of the same considerations. We've talked about at length in previous videos covering the GBU-57 bunker buster shortage and the broader strain on assets like the B-2 fleet. If you're a military planner and you start reallocating strike packages every single time an adversary makes a dramatic public claim, whether or not the claim is even verified, you risk losing the coherent, methodical targeting plan you've spent weeks or months developing, all in service of responding to what might just be propaganda designed to provoke exactly that kind of reactive response. The fact that CENTCOM's 10th consecutive night of strikes looked essentially identical in scope and target categories to the nights before and after the specific Amazon claim tells you the actual military campaign plan wasn't meaningfully disrupted or redirected by this particular piece of Iranian messaging, which I think is actually a pretty strong signal of operational discipline, whether or not it was a deliberate messaging choice on the Pentagon's part. I also want to touch on what this means for how ordinary people and businesses in the Gulf region are experiencing this war, because I think that's a dimension that gets lost when we're focused purely on the military strategy and messaging analysis. If you're a business in Bahrain, Kuwait, the UAE, or anywhere else in the region, relying on Amazon's cloud infrastructure for your daily operations, banking, logistics, communications, whatever it might be, the uncertainty created by these dueling claims and counterclaims is itself a genuine problem, completely separate from whether the specific strike actually happened or not. Not knowing whether your cloud provider's regional infrastructure is actually degraded, whether you should be building in contingency plans for service disruptions, whether the disruption showing on a status page reflects new damage or old, unresolved issues from months earlier. That kind of operational uncertainty creates real costs and real anxiety for businesses trying to function normally in the middle of an active war zone, even when the specific claimed attack turns out to be questionable or unverified. War doesn't just create physical destruction, it creates this pervasive fog of uncertainty that ripples through an entire regional economy. And I think that's an underappreciated cost of exactly this kind of information warfare tactic, regardless of which side is employing it or how effective any individual claim actually turns out to be. Let's also talk about what this specific pattern might mean for how future conflicts get fought and reported on, because I genuinely think we're watching something that's going to be studied by military strategists and journalists for years to come. The targeting of commercial cloud infrastructure, the difficulty of verifying claimed strikes against digital infrastructure compared to physical military targets, the strategic value of dramatic claims regardless of their accuracy, all of this represents a genuinely new frontier that doesn't have decades of established doctrine and reporting practices built up around it the way traditional military targeting does. Journalists and analysts covering this conflict are essentially building the playbook for how to verify and report on this kind of claim in real time. And I think what we're seeing here, official caution from Bahrain, silence from Amazon, careful hedging language from major news outlets like CNBC and Reuters, explicitly noting they were unable to independently verify the claim, represents a reasonably healthy, appropriately skeptical approach to a genuinely difficult verification problem. That kind of institutional caution matters enormously, because the alternative, treating every dramatic wartime claim as confirmed fact, simply because it generates attention, would make it essentially impossible for anyone following this conflict to maintain an accurate picture of what's actually happening on the ground versus what's simply being claimed for strategic messaging purposes. Okay, let me give you my take here as a professional pilot on what this whole episode tells us. Number one, I think this shows you that a huge part of how this war is actually being fought now happens in the information space, just as much as the physical battlefield. Iran clearly understands that a dramatic claim about destroying American commercial infrastructure generates headlines and international attention regardless of whether it's fully verified. And that's become a real, deliberate tool in how they're managing public perception of this conflict, alongside the actual physical strikes. Number two, I think the US military's non-reaction here is actually a pretty disciplined strategic choice, whether it was deliberate or just a natural consequence of already running a full-scale sustained campaign. Getting pulled into responding to every single claim, verified or not, risks letting the adversary dictate your operational tempo and your target priorities. By continuing the same systematic campaign against military command centers, air defenses, and missile capabilities, regardless of this specific claim, the U.S. signals that its strategy isn't being shaped reactively by Iranian propaganda. It's being driven by its own independent assessment of what actually needs to be degraded to accomplish the broader military objectives of this campaign. Number three, and I think this is honestly the biggest takeaway, the targeting of commercial cloud infrastructure in this war, confirmed or not in this specific instance, represents a genuinely new frontier in how modern conflicts get fought. Data centers supporting financial transactions, government services, and civilian digital life are now explicitly being treated as legitimate wartime targets by at least one side of this conflict. And that's a precedent that every country with critical cloud infrastructure, which at this point is basically every developed economy on the planet, is going to have to seriously reckon with going forward, regardless of how this specific war eventually ends. All right, that's my breakdown of the Amazon claim and what actually happened in response. Let me know down in the comments, do you think Iran's claim here holds up? Or does this look more like propaganda that fell apart under basic scrutiny? And what do you make of the US just continuing its campaign without missing a beat? I want to hear your thoughts. It's genuinely one of the more interesting threads of this entire war to follow, precisely because it sits right at that intersection of military strategy, information warfare, and basic fact-checking. And I think it's worth all of us staying skeptical of dramatic claims from either side until real, independent verification actually catches up, rather than just running with whatever headline grabs the most attention in the moment. If you found this breakdown valuable, go ahead and hit that like button for me. It genuinely helps get this kind of content out to more people, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, because I'm covering every part of this conflict as it develops, including the parts that happen in the information space just as much as the parts that happen with actual missiles and actual airstrikes. Go ahead and follow me on X, follow me on Instagram. I'm posting pretty much every day, links in the description. And join the Max Ready Room if you want priority replies during the live streams. I'm doing those pretty much daily right now, given how fast this situation keeps moving. And honestly, given how much of it now plays out through competing claims and statements just as much as through footage of actual strikes, it's worth having a place where we can walk through what's actually verified together in real time, rather than just reacting to whatever headline crosses your feed first. And then check out this video right here. I think you're going to enjoy it. This is Ryan, also known as Max Afterburner, also known as the fighter pilot next door, signing off.